There we go.
Okay.
Right, and let me just pop myself in the spotlight for a sec. Okay, guys, welcome to the first Virtual Folk Club hosted talk. I am joined today by our guest speaker, Caroline Preece, who will introduce herself in some detail in just a moment. Just a couple of quick points. So as I say, this is our first talk. This will be available for the next 7 days for everybody in the Facebook group. For everybody who is a Clubhouse member, this will be recorded indefinitely and placed in there for you to review back. Okay, we will have some time for questions as we go through. So anything that comes up, just pop a comment into the chat or anything similar, and we'll find a nice natural pause to throw some questions in. I'm sure Caroline will be happy to respond to those. And I'm not going to describe what we're about to discuss because I probably won't do it any justice. So I will hand over to Caroline now, and I will just pop you onto the spotlight. And let somebody else in at the last minute. There we go. Okay, Caroline, over to yourself. I'll just mute everyone else just now, and we'll go from there and see how things run. We'll probably just tweak it as we go.
Okay, I could give you a long spiel and a long introduction here, but actually I think the introduction to my talk itself will give you more information about where I'm coming from, how this has come about. But it's very much what I hope to do is give you a different way of thinking about things, a different way of looking at things, empower you to go out and not and actually do create photos which mean something. So if you bear with me, a little bit of background. I am obviously a photographer, LRPS and Royal Photographics Association, photographic judge for the last 2 years. Lockdown's been a great opportunity because I've been judging around the country, but I also got the opportunity to put this talk together. And they always say that everyone's got one book in them. This is probably my version of a book. So, okay, let's do the screen. The screen share is always the most nerve-wracking bit of everything. So bear with me one moment. I have to go through a few hoops to get this. And then you, okay, can everyone see Caroline's shared screen?
We have a little bit of white down the side, but yes, that looks okay.
That's part of the slide, so
okay,
that's fine. Yeah, it does confuse people. Okay, great. So before I start, there's a couple of places in here. There's a little bit of audience participation. I will let you know once we've reached them. It'll be very clear. But hopefully, I hope you enjoy it. So, to start off with, let me just shrink that. So, as I said, I'd give the explanation as part of this talk. So how did this actually talk come about? And it's very much a result of a journey I've been on and I'm still on. It all started when I was listening to judges talk about putting things on the third. I'm not very good at just accepting things. I need to understand them. I very much think holistically. For me, the why is more important than the what. If I know why, I can make informed decisions. You could just say I'm really bad at following instructions. What I found, however, was that no one ever talked about what impact following or breaking the so-called rules actually had on the image, other than it made it better. I mean, that for me was an issue. How can I make decisions and choices based on no information, no real information? And this is very much what this talk is about, empowerment, and also sharing what I've learned so far on my photographic journey. I believe fundamentally we're taught composition in the wrong way. There's not enough focus placed on photography as a visual language or on the psychology behind how we interpret visual elements in an image. Instead, what we get are endless conversations about rules and breaking them. And this doesn't help us create meaningful, impactful images. I mean, I watched a great presentation by Guy Tarl a little while back, and he had a section on composition. And the first point was, don't look at tips on composition. learn the science. And this is where a lot of it is going to be coming into. So what should we be taught? What should we be taught? What we should be taught is the effects of our choices on how the viewer experiences our image. And through learning this, we can communicate more effectively through our images. What I hope to do is take you on a journey which makes you look at photography and a composition in a different light, empowers you to make conscious choices about how your images look and feel. And these choices will enable you to express what you want to say and make the viewer look at what you want them to look at and make them feel, more importantly, what you want them to feel. These choices don't all need to be done in camera. They can also happen at the editing stage when you select which photos you want to use, and also at the post-processing change when you produce the photos. And to be honest, I'm going to be honest, if you've not come across this before, there's a lot to take in. You won't remember it all. But for me, I think the important thing is sharing another way of looking at things, a way of looking at things which is not that commonly talked about, and hopefully, therefore, creating a curiosity to explore and learn more. The talk itself is based on visual design, visual language, and psychology. The tools I'll be talking about aren't anything new. They're used in the design of websites, user interfaces on computers, marketing, etc. It's just for some reason, they're not talked about that much in the photography context. And in this context, it's not amazingly easy to find information beyond the basic rules. And what I'll do is I'm including a list of sources in the next slide, and I'll also share these after the talk, and I'll send them through so they can be forwarded to you. So these are just starting points, and these helped me start on my journey. The first two, we've got two videos there, YouTube videos by Eileen Rafferty. She is an American photographer, lecturer. This is on the B&H YouTube channel. And I mean, they're very well, anything by her there is actually really informative. And then we've got several books by David Duchamine. He's published an awful lot. He's really, really interesting the way he thinks about photography. He talks about photography. These are just a couple of interesting ones, but he's also got a website and a blog and a podcast, very much worth following. Then for me, I think the book which was really transformational is See It, Photographic Composition Using Visual Intensity. This allowed me to put the information I learned elsewhere into a context which made sense to myself. It's about how do you create, it's about how you actually take the tools and then create an image which feels as if you want it, as you want it to feel. So as I said, those, don't worry about those. I'll show them again at the end, and also I'll email them through so that they can be distributed. So, I mean, the talk itself will be in 3 sections. Section 1's covering photography as a visual language and expressing yourself in photography. Section 2 covers how we make sense of the visual world. And section 3 then comes on to more sort of technical areas where we start putting this into practice and looking at some key elements and what's the impact of them in your photographs. So the starting point, and this is where it all starts. Are there rules to break? Do they actually exist? We talk about them, but for me, personally, I don't believe there are rules. There are only tools, and this is where the title comes from. You can forget the idea of rules. There's choices and visual consequences. For every decision you make, it has an impact on how the image feels to the viewer, how the viewer experiences the image, how effective it is in communicating. If you understand about these choices, you can then make informed decisions. This is where the empowerment comes in. You can stop worrying about, is it in the third, is it in the center, and all those different aspects, especially if you're part of a camera club, you often hear judges talking about. It comes into actually, what impact does this have on my image? And the image we've got here is one of mine. It's from a series I'm doing along the British coast. And very much for me, I think there's a curious, it's not the main resorts, it's places beside the main resorts. And I think there's a curious atmosphere. I call it slightly surreal. People debate. There's a debate about what's real and what's not. But I feel the slightly odd nature of the image itself expresses my reaction to the seaside and these seaside resorts. So this is a quote from Bill Brandt. Photography has no rules. It's not a sport. It is a result which counts, no matter how it's achieved. So, I mean, why do people even talk about rules and guidelines? Is there any place for them whatsoever? And I think as you start off, it sometimes helps to have some basic guidelines to follow whilst we figure everything out. And I have a horse background, so I tend to compare a lot to horses and riding and training. Basically, rules are the equivalent of teaching a beginner to ride a horse. When you first get on a horse, you teach someone to kick to go, pull the left rein to go left, right rein to go right, both reins to stop. As you become more proficient, however, you learn to refine this. Weight your left seat bone to turn left, ride straight in a circle, control the shoulders. If you started off telling a total beginner on a horse to weight their left seat bone to turn left, they'll be dealing with so much other stuff that they'd really struggle. They'd look at you as if you've gone totally mental, and they may never get back on the horse again because everything is far too complicated. It's no longer fun. And I think in any hobby or sport, you simplify things for people to help them at the very start of their journey. The next stage, however, is to go beyond this. And going beyond this is what started me on my journey exploring the psychology behind composition. So in summary, rules do make life easy, but moving beyond them will help get your photography to the next level. It will help you to be more creative, make more informed choices, make images feel like you want them to feel. So, for example, if your photo is about dereliction, make it feel that way. If you're photographing a beautiful beach scene, how do you make sure it does not feel like a scene from a horror movie? And conversely, how to put tension and edginess into your image. And this can actually, and talking about the beach, this can actually be done by ICM. So ICM can be used to create a very artistic feel, very simple, smooths a lot of the lines out. However, if you only use a slight amount of ICM, you can actually make it feel a little bit like a Rocky Horror, Blair Witch Project, where you're running through a forest, everything's slightly out of focus, there's nothing you can grasp upon. So it's like so it's actually looking about what do you want to achieve by the technique you're using, what are you saying in your image?
Sorry, Caroline, what is ICM?
Sorry, intentional camera movement.
Ah, brilliant, thank you.
It's when you purposely move your camera to blur things.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks, Natalie.
Sorry. If I do use jargon, please do stop me. So you forget what's jargon and what's not after a while. It's a bad habit.
That's okay, thank you.
No worries. So next section, what is photography? Bit of an odd statement for talk and photography, but bear with me. I think what we often lose sight of is fundamentally photography is a visual language. It's a form of communication through pictures as opposed to words. There's a photographer called Ming Fine, and I love this quote from him. Photography is fundamentally a relationship between the photographer and the viewer. Nothing more, nothing less. At its core, a successful image is about communication. It must tell the viewer the photographer's intended story through an entirely and solely visual means of communication. So, what makes a strong photograph? A strong photograph is one where the photographer has something to say, where they have a voice, where their unique take on the world shines through in their image. And I think it's all about finding your voices. What do you have to say about the world you live in and the subjects you photograph? It's when you start thinking about this and start thinking about creating your image with this in mind, it leads to the creation of images with impact. Photos people remember. Photos people stop in front of as opposed to just passing by. And even when you don't have words to express what you want to say or what you feel, your images can speak for you. So this is an image I took in rush hour, obviously pre-COVID. And I mean, if you're looking at it and thinking about photography as a communication, does it make you feel comfortable? Does it make rush hour feel a pleasant place to be? Does it feel a friendly, welcoming place? looking at this image, would you want to be part of that rush hour? So it's very much putting my take on rush hour and what it's like to commute in London into an image to express how I feel about it. So this is where the bit of audience participation comes in. Bear with me, as a little bit of a random statement for photography talk, but it will all make sense. And what I want you to do is call out the first thing which comes to your mind when you hear the word chocolate.
Delicious.
Smooth.
Anybody else?
Sweet.
So we've got just three, of the 9 of us, 10 of us, we've just got 3 answers then. But even
Creamy.
those, sorry?
Creamy.
Creamy. 4 answers.
Take yourself off mute, guys.
So should have added that in. But
I think there was another one come through there as well.
Sorry?
I think there was a guy's voice adding something extra.
Yeah, texture.
Texture.
Or brown.
Yeah. So a small selection of us, there's only a small selection of us here. Chocolate is an incredibly simple subject. It's a very, very simple thing compared to the complexity of the world. But we even think about this entirely different. If you think of how many separate different words we've come up with and things for people, for something as simple as chocolate, and then imagine how this translates to more complex matters. And I think the key thing to think about this is basically, we're often not aware of actually how unique we are and how differently we experience the world. And I mean, this exercise itself comes from a management book about communication, and it's more designed with actually working in the boardroom area, and you put a strategy together and everyone goes, yay, I know what you're talking about. And in reality, yeah, no one does. But it really applies, because everyone is very unique, experiences the world differently, thinks about the world differently. And this is really important when we think about photography as a visual language and the importance of communicating your viewpoint. Because fundamentally, you're unique, you're special, you see and think about things differently from everybody else. And this then can be reflected in your photography and how you actually communicate through your images. So a strong photograph is where the photographer felt a connection to the subject matter and where they have something to say about a time, a place, a situation, or an emotion. And as you can see, for something as simple as chocolate, you've all got something totally different to say about it. So in practice, landscape photography, you need to know, what is it in particular about the scene you want to show the viewer? What do you want to bring to their attention? Fundamentally, what is landscape photography? It's saying, hey, stop, look at this, because XXX is what I find amazing and beautiful. And I think it's also important to remember when you put photographs together, if you're not interested in what you photograph, how do you think the viewer will think about it? If you're not interested and you're just taking a photograph of something to take a photograph of something, why should the viewer be interested? So for example, if you've no interest in people, you're never going to make a great street photographer. If you're not interested in and passionate about animals, this will be reflected in your wildlife photography or lack soul. So once again, it's coming back to that communication, your personal passions, and how you express yourself through your images. So for me, this is from a personal context. I've always had an interest in people. Years ago, I temped in an organisation called the Institute of Civil Engineer in London. And they had this building lined with staircase lined with old-fashioned portraits of random men who were successful engineers in their time. I mean, there's all these really grand, dark Victorian type portraits. And I used to absolutely love looking at them. I studied them, imagined who they were, what they did, their stories. I was fascinated by the people in them, the pictures and the people in them. I mean, you could almost say it's like time travel. These people were taken out of their time and transported into the 21st century. I've always had a fascination. I've never done it. And I think if I ever did it and we moved in together, my boyfriend would kill me. But I've always liked the idea of having random strangers on my wall. It's just me. It's a bit weird, I know. But I also love, but putting this together, I also love listening to conversations on trains, in shopping centres and cafes, where other people get annoyed at loud conversations. I think they're absolutely great. It leaves you speculating about what happened before and after. They're like short stories in a book, but without context, moments and time. I basically people watch and people listen, and the people don't even need to be alive, they can be in pictures. And unsurprisingly, therefore, quite a lot of my photography is street photography. It's what I'm interested in, it's what I'm passionate about. But also, I mean, we're not single dimensional, we're multidimensional. I also tend to think in stories. And this I very much blame my mother for. I'm an only child, overactive imagination. It always sounds like I should have a violin up. I don't mean it that way. But when you're growing up at home, had no one to play with, I had to create my own world, stories and adventures, entertain myself. And I think this very much shows through in my photography. Through the conscious use of cropping to include and exclude things from the frame, I can express these stories, create connections and imply relationships where none existed, create my own fictions. It's not all my photography, but there's a definite element within there. And it comes back to, once again, the chocolate conversation. It's my perspective on the world. And if you look at this image here, I have deliberately cropped the top of the details off. You can't see what that man on the left is actually standing against. You can't see what's above. The guys, you can't see any more detail about the guy walking off. There seems to be, for me, it feels like there's been a meeting of some sort, an assignation, and they've separated. The reality is actually they were totally unconnected. That wall is within Canary Wharf. He's actually looking over at the water beyond. But by the sort of choice of how I've cropped it, I've created that story there. I've created questions for the viewer. And also I think often when you don't include everything in an image, it makes it more engaging for the viewer because they start filling in the gaps. So here, you don't know what the people look like. So the viewer starts actually thinking about and speculating about it and imagining. They're not given everything on the plate. So this is a quote by David Duchovny. Photography is an extraordinary means of communication, but first we need to have something to say. I think it's important to think about, if you don't find the slightest reflection of yourself in your images, they become generic. They could be taken by anyone. It's a photograph of something, not about something. You hear a lot of people talk about trying to develop their own style, the importance of their style, worrying about it. And I think actually you don't need to worry about this. If you do photographs, which mean something to you, if you try and communicate through your photographs, if you take photographs which appeal to you and you look through, over time you'll start finding your own style there. It happens naturally, provided that you actually take photographs which are your voice, as opposed to trying to please other people with them. But I think, but it's also, as I say, among that lines, photographs won't speak to your viewer if you yourself don't have anything to say. So thinking about what wows, shocks, moves, or horrifies you. How do you see the world? How do you think about things? And Rachel Talabot, she's done, I don't know if you've come across the series Sirens. It's a series of photos of waves which she's given names. They're absolutely stunning. And she says, find the thing you love, the thing you're willing to spend more time looking at than other people. Through looking at something or being around something a lot, you develop your own opinion, viewpoints, and perspectives. And you're able to say to somebody, hey, look at this. Show people things they may not have actually noticed before. So when you look at something, ask yourself, what do I see? What do I feel? And what can I eliminate to show this better? And we'll go into more detail on what can I eliminate a bit further through the talk, but that's an absolutely critical element to it. Won't say any more, reveal too many secrets. And I say photographs can be a reflection of or a reaction to your environment or even your state of mind. For instance, having grown up in a beautiful area of the world, I'm fascinated by starker, harsher landscapes. It's a reaction to the environment of my childhood. It's nothing unusual. I grew up in the South Downs National Park in a village of 300 houses. And if you look at this photograph, this was taken in Vlorë in Albania. And it was the harshness, the starkness of the trees and the environment. It was actually taken, Flores is actually a resort, and they've done quite a bit of work to, in theory, make it more appealing. But when I got there, their work involved an awful lot of pale concrete paving slabs, a lone fairground, and these rather forlorn trees, very stark and the fog against the actual land on the horizon. And for me, it's because I've grown up in such a warm, rich, beautiful area. That for me, I find absolutely fascinating because it's different. And that's very common. We often find things interesting which are different from our own experiences, hence the popularity of travel photography and programs. But alternatively, you may actually want to show people in your images the reality of the world you came from. You may have something to say about that. So it's what you're passionate about, what interests you. And there's a guy called David Allen Harvey, and I love this quote: "Don't shoot what it looks like, shoot what it feels like." So this is Amberley Wildbrooks in flood. Amberley Wildbrooks is managed wetlands behind the village I live in. Every winter it's flood, and I find there's an absolutely curious beauty about the winter. The floods create their own new landscapes. There's a sense of peace, a sense of tranquility. It's very much simplified by the water. And this is an image I took in lockdown. I like to say blurry birds are original, but it's a whole tradition of people who've done some really great blurry birds photos. But it's a response, and it was taken during the first lockdown, and it's very much a response to the situation myself and everybody else found themselves in. And when you look at a photograph, everyone will put their own world and interpretations in it. But thinking about, what does that feel to you? How does that feel to you? Can you relate to the sense of the emptiness and the birds and the freedom in the sky compared to being locked down yourself, not able to go anywhere? So within images, there are 3 stages to actually ensure that you communicate effectively through them. There's a taking stage, the photo selection stage, and the post-processing. The process of expressing your voice in the images isn't just at the taking stage. Yes, you want to get it right in camera as much as possible, but often we very much underestimate the importance of the photo selection stage, especially if you're doing something as fast-moving as street photography, where you don't really know what you've got until you get it home. So the taking stage is where you select your subject matter, frame it, make technical choices, press the button, set yourself up the best you can for success. With image selection, however, it's when you get your photos home, especially digital, you bring a lot of photos home. And you want to decide which out of all these photos are you going to process and show people. And this is where the understanding of visual design and how the composition impacts the viewer can help you become better at choosing the strongest images. And we'll come more onto this in parts 2 and 3. And then obviously we have the post-processing stage. And through your post-processing choices, you can continue on the journey of ensuring you're communicating effectively through your images. So the strongest photos with the most impact are photos about something, not of something. This is a little bit of a strange concept initially. It's not necessarily that easy to put into words, but I've got some images that will help explaining. And I know I've had this conversation a number of times with friends, and they've looked at me as if I've gone absolutely mental until I can actually put examples forward. But it's a really important thing. To make an engaging photo, it needs to be about something. Once again, the about is you expressing your voice and your opinion and how you see things and how you see the world. So for example, these are photos by David Duchamine. They're photographs of bears, but they're about 2 totally different things. The photo on the left is, you've got a bear in relaxation, it's asleep, It's a very peaceful, quiet image. It's very chilled. The one on the right, however, is totally different. They've both got bears in, but the one on the right is all about family and family connection, where you've got the mother bear and her 2 cubs playing in the background. She's sitting there with her back to them. She knows where they are. She's probably a bit knackered of having looked after them, but it is very much about that family interaction between the different subjects. So as I said, they're both of bears, but stories within them are totally different. So you can see, look at the bear at rest and compare the story in that image to the next. Same subject bears, but they've both got strong stories and 2 totally different stories. And this is an image I took myself. This was done in Westfield Shopping Centre in East London. I very much stopped at this location because of the light. I was loving how people were backlit. And as I mentioned before, with these situations, you'll take a number of images. It's only getting home and looking through them, you find the images which really speak to you. And out of the many I took, this was the only one which jumped out. And for me, it was because of the emotion and mood within the actual subject. It was about 5, 6 o'clock at the end of the day. I mean, she's beautiful, but she just looks so tired and sort of worn out and run down as she's going home. And there's just something about that, the story, the narrative with the image, which really resonated with me, and I really connected with, and it really jumped out at me. And that's why, out of all the images I took, this was the one which actually I chose because of the strong storytelling content within it. Another quote, along the same subject, painter Robert Henri said, "Paint the flying spirit of the bird rather than its feathers." And it's very similar to the quote by David Allen Harvey we mentioned earlier. Paint what it feels like, have something to say about the bird. I mean, yes, these things are easier to say than do, but an understanding of the impact on the viewer of the tools of composition, the decisions we make in post-processing will help us get there. It will get us much further than worrying about rules and breaking them. So I got some absolutely stunning images. This is by a photographer called Alistair Benn. It's from his Scottish photographer. It's from his series Music from the Dark Spaces. And it's of a tree, it's of a forest, but it all feels about light, atmosphere and mood. I think it's an absolutely beautiful image. And it's an image that you could sit there and it says a lot, and you could spend time looking a lot of time looking at. And this is another of his images from the series Out of Darkness. Once again, it's of dunes, but it's all about light, shape, pattern. He's taken the subject of a dunes and made it about something, and because of that, it has a lot of impact. It has a lot of interest. And this is an image from a Japanese photographer, Yashiro Ogawa. One of the brilliant side effects of putting this talk together was I discovered some photographers I'd never come across before. And I absolutely love this photographer's work. It's all about mood and atmosphere. This image is from a series called Dreaming in her latest photo book, which was published in February 2020. It's a collection of black and white photographs shot during his travels throughout Asia over the past 30 years. And I think it's got such a strong sense of place and environment. It's almost like a fairy tale feel to it. But for me, it really communicates. But obviously photography is all personal, and how you respond to it is personal and subjective. And another quote, Don McCullen, the well-known war photographer, now landscape. "Photography for me is not looking, it's feeling. If you can't feel what you're looking at, then you're never going to get others to feel anything when they look at your photos." And this is an image he took during the Cuban Missile Crisis of a protest. And looking at that, just think to yourself, what do you think his point of view was? Where do you think his sympathy lies? What do you think he is trying to express? I mean, you've that guy, this lone figure, sitting on the floor with these row of dark policemen towering above him. I don't know how many there was, probably about 20 or so. I've never counted, for just that one lone man. I think for me, it very clearly has a very clear point of view, a very clear communication within the image, very clear story within the image. This is another of Don McCullen's images. This is the battle for the city of South Vietnam, and it's a US Marine inside the civilian house. And once again, I think there's such a strong storytelling narrative within this image. It's very simple, just 3 components. You have the soldier, you have the window, and then you've got that painting. And that painting is absolutely critical to the photo of the family is absolutely critical to the story, because it takes that conflict and puts the civilian context around it. This is a conflict which is not just between states, various powers. It impacts the lives of everyday people. This photo wouldn't have been put together as a chance occurrence. He would have thought very strongly about what he included, what he didn't include, and also from the photos he brought back, which ones is he actually going to show. But it is about putting that narrative and communicating your point of view throughout your images. What are you trying to say about the subject you photograph? And what... So going on to photography as a visual language. It's basically, to summarize, I mean, we've been pretty much talking about photography as a visual language up to now. But to summarize what we've said before, photography is a form of communication without words. As you've seen from some of those earlier images, there's really strong stories and narratives coming through. The people are expressing their personal take on the view, on the scenes in front of them, whether it could be something as simple as that light coming through those trees is absolutely stunning, to something really hard-hitting documentary type war photography, such as the impact of war on families. And as a photographer, what we're trying to do is develop our visual language to make images which connect with the audience. And we can only connect with the audience if we ourselves connect with the subject matter. So through the understanding of the tools of composition, we can make a photograph feel like we want it to. It allows us to let the viewer into our world. We can enable the viewer to feel like they're there alongside us. We can provoke emotion in the viewer. We can raise awareness of something which concerns us. We can tell stories, or we can even say something as simple as, wow, look at this. How amazing and beautiful the light is here. And I think also what I haven't put there as well, but it comes into the communication, as a really interesting photographer called Paul Sanders. I think his website's Still Photography. He was a former picture editor of the Times who had a nervous breakdown, and has moved into landscape photography. His images are absolutely incredible, but he's a big advocate of mindfulness throughout photography. And his images very much a reflection of his state of mind, and often you'll find, and his images tend to be very simple, very minimalistic. And having listened to him talk, it counters what's going on in his head and the busyness. It provides that mental space. So it's just something to add to that list. So a core part of photography as visual design, as a visual language, is understanding the principles of visual design. When you understand this, you stop worrying about rules and breaking them. You understand the impact of your decisions on the viewer, and then you can make informed choices. And we're going to go into more detail in this in section 2. But through an understanding of visual design at the taking stage, image selection stage, and the subsequent work in post-processing, you can control where the viewer looks, in what order they look at the objects in the image, what they perceive the subject to be, how they experience the environment the subject is in. For instance, cold, warm, relaxing, scary, decaying, and therefore how they actually experience the image itself, what they understand from the image. So 4 questions to help you take more impactful images. What is the why? What is it you want to show people, say, with your photo? When you're at a location, say you're wanting to take a landscape photograph, you're in this location, it's absolutely stunning. Then it's stopping there and thinking, what is it in particular that wows me? What in particular amazed me? what is it that in particular that I want to show people and say with my photo? And it comes into also, what's the feeling you want to convey? What's the mood and atmosphere? How are you experiencing that scene? And also, how do you want the viewer to respond and feel when they look at it? I think this is a really great quote from David Duchovny. I really do feel like I should actually contact him and start getting royalties. But I mean, he is brilliant, a lot of what he says. So you can put the main subject on the leftmost third of the image and still have an image without heart. You can watch the edges of your frame and make sure your portrait subject is looking into, not out of the frame as you've been told to do. You can keep your horizon straight and get high marks at the camera club and still not have an image which feels the way you hoped it would. Why? Because composition and all the principles that we need to understand to make our photographs do the million things we might ask them to do are only tools. It's how we use them that matters. So the next section is coming on to how we make sense of the visual world. And in this section, I will talk a little bit about Gestalt psychology. It will all be revealed. But before coming on to that, I think it's useful to look at this is a list I put together of visual elements which influence how others experience and view our work. It's not, obviously it's not a complete list. There's a whole range of different subjects, but it just gives you a starting point. The ones in blue are the ones I'm actually going to touch on here in the actual talk itself. If we talked about everything, we would be here forever. But so, for example, just looking at the impact of colour and saturation, which I'm not talking about later on, it's, I think, a really interesting little exercise there is to watch adverts for charities. Because you've got the problem, i.e. They call the problem statement. So what is there in the world which is going wrong? How are people suffering? How are animals suffering? What needs to be fixed? Then they ask you for money, and then they have the happily ever after bit. And you'll find a lot of these adverts very consciously use colour and saturation to influence how the viewer experiences the story and how they feel about it. So often the before images are bluer toned, sort of cooler, less warm and cheerful, it's desaturated. It all feels that little bit more negative through the use of tone and saturation, cooler tones and less saturation. And then they have the stage where someone they say, give us money, we can do this. And then they show you the happily ever after. And generally the happily ever after, the colours are much more saturated, it's much more bright and cheerful. There's a lot warmer colours. It's to evoke that positive response in the audience. So psychologically, they're controlling how your journey through the stages of the advert to this person or animal or subject situation is negative, it's bad, they're suffering. You give money, it all gets better. So as I said at the very start, there's a lot of these tools which is used outside the world of photography. We just don't talk about it so much in photography. And there's another one there, it's our cultural background and life experiences. No two people will interpret images the same. They always say there's three people viewing a photograph. It's a photographer. Well, there's three parts to viewing a photograph. It's a photographer, there's the viewer, and then there's a cultural context. And images, the cultural context and how we interpret images can change over time based on how the world and the environment changes. And also how the viewer experiences it is very much based on their own personal life experiences as well. So we can endeavour to communicate, but the message received may not necessarily be 100% the same as the message given, but it's trying to actually communicate as effectively as possible to actually join those two elements up. So elements which influence the viewer's experience of the photograph. Oops, sorry, I don't know how that's ended up duplicate, apologies. So this is the next bit of audience participation. If you can unmute yourself and just call out what you see there.
Rectangle, a circle, and triangle. Some like a little background thingy going on at the end.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you.
I was thinking a square more than a rectangle.
Sorry, did I say rectangle? I meant square. Sorry.
Yeah, the answer was close enough for my purposes, which was good. The actual fact, and I think this is something really interesting to look at, because I mean, the answer you've given is probably the answer 99.9% of people have given, unless they're aware of this. And that's the fact that they're actually not shapes. They're just lines on a white background. And this is how our brain will try and create order out of a chaotic world around us. Our brain prefers complete shapes, so we automatically fill in gaps between elements to help complete that help create a complete shape, because they are literally just random lines with gaps, but we all will read them as a square, circle, and triangle, because it's how our brain makes sense of the world. So I mean, it gives you a hint. So that one will give you a hint what this is. I mean, if I asked you to start off with, what do you see here? Everybody would say a zebra. Probably now, still quite a few people would say zebra, but you've been given a hint by the previous actual shapes. If you look at the zebra, or what looks like a zebra, you will actually see there's no outline. If you look at the front legs, there's large gaps where there's just nothing whatsoever. It's black lines on a white background, and our brain has been taught to fill in the gaps to create a recognizable pattern based on our experience. And this comes very much back to evolution, because, and I'll talk more about this in a moment in more detail, but we needed, in a very complex environment, if there was a lion partially hidden by the undergrowth, and you only saw bits of that lion or other ferocious beast going back many millennia, if we had to wait until our brain actually carefully went through, well, that line could be this, that line could be that. Actually, if I join this up, that's a lion. We'd probably be dinner. So it is actually how our brains have been taught to. Our brains like simplicity. Our brains will actually look at what is there in our experience we've come across before to make sense of the shape we actually see. Your mind fills in the missing information to create recognizable patterns based on your experience. I mean, the two previous examples is what's known as the Gestalt principle of closure. In other words, when you see an image that has missing parts, your brain will fill in the blanks and make a complete image so you can still recognize a pattern. The mind complete shapes that don't exist. Another thing is like thinking about faces and trees. Sorry? Faces and trees. And so what is Gestalt? Gestalt theories were developed by German psychologists in the 1920s. It's about how we perceive things visually. They're based on the belief that the mind self-organizes what it sees to form a global whole view. According to Gestalt psychology, how humans interpret what they see in the world depends on what they expect to see. Humans try to simplify the visual elements so that we instantly recognize shapes and forms, like the lion example I was given. And these theories are used to explain, Gestalt theories are used to how we explain, how we perceive things, how we make sense of the visual elements of the world around. So Gestalt principle is the whole, the overarching thing is the whole is other than some of its parts. It's often misinterpreted in terms of the whole is more than some of its parts, but the other is a very key word. The whole is different from the sum of all its parts. So to summarize, when we face a visually chaotic scene, our mind simplifies it into more recognizable patterns. And because photography is an act of presenting an image to the viewer, we can use Gestalt principles to create a story or suggest something to the viewer. The principles help us deliver the idea of the picture in a better way. And awareness, when both taking images and selecting our images to post-processing, and awareness of Gestalt will help us produce images that communicate more effectively what we want to say. It also, however, provides an introduction to what will come in the talk later on. The idea that when we look at something, there's a whole load of stuff which goes on in the background in our minds which we're not normally aware of. For instance, how our brain reacts to things such as different types of lines or colours. We don't just see the line or colour. At a deeper psychological level, we associate it with different things. And I say this is we're coming on to section 3. There's over 10 overlapping principles in Gestalt. It's a big subject. I'm just going to introduce a few, and you can research this more if you're interested, but I'm just sort of giving you a taste of it. So the Gestalt principle of closure, which we've covered. Nearly familiar lines and shapes are more readily seen as a mind prefers things which are complete than incomplete. Then we've got the Gestalt theory of proximity. A pair or group of objects that are close to each other are more likely to be perceived as part of a group belonging together rather than individual elements. The further apart they are, the more this connection is reduced. The objects don't just need to be similar in any other way. Sorry, the objects don't need to be similar in any other way other than just being close to each other. So with this, your brain will automatically look at that and it won't think of it necessarily as lots of blue dots. It will think of a square and 3 columns, because the spaces between are as important as the actual dots themselves, because that actually creates that sense of proximity between those between the various dots. And then we have the Gestalt principle of similarity, and I will come on with some images to actually demonstrate this better in a moment, but I'm just introducing the basic concepts. So Gestalt principle of similarity, a pair or group of objects that are close to each other are more likely to be perceived. So things that are similar tend to be grouped together. That's my fault. Gestalt similarity, things which are similar tend to be grouped together. So in this image, red circles are seen as related to other red circles. The black circles are seen to be related due to the similarity in colour as well. You tend to view this as black, you separate it into black and red circles. And when it comes to photography, proximity and similarity can be used to both imply relationships which may or may not exist in reality. They can make connections believable. They can also make existing connections which you're trying what you want to say unbelievable, or not even necessarily visible. So an awareness of it is really useful within your images. So where this one of the things I do in photography is over the summer months, at weekends, I do event photography at horse shows. So a number of these images are taken from that, and I think they're useful to demonstrate the concept. So it's thinking about a pair of objects that are close to each other are more likely to be perceived as belonging together than if they're far apart. If you look at the image on the left, the two horses, the driver, photography is 2D, so the driver looks relatively close to the horse behind. The two horses are close together. The woman of the rosette's close together. You perceive all 4 elements of that image as connected. It feels like a team. It feels like the woman with the rosette is part of that team. She could be a groom, she could be a friend. There feels that strong connection. On the right, however, you've got the gentleman with his horse, and then the gentleman standing a lot further apart with a bowler hat on. He doesn't feel like he's connected as to the actual gentleman or the horse. Now, there is no right or wrong in reality in terms of, maybe rephrase that, say, in reality, that the relationships could be entirely different. You've made assumptions just based on how close those elements are together. So for instance, that woman with the rosette, she could be entirely separate. She could not know the woman, not know the horses. For the photograph, she could have just stepped in to hold the rosette. She could be the judge who's just stepped in just to pose, saying, I've awarded the prize. In contrast, however, the image on the right, the guy with the bowler hat could have actually been the person who bred that horse. He could have actually raised that horse from a young foal, be the brother of the man in the carriage, and be very closely connected, but just wanted to separate himself for the photo. However, through the closeness of the different elements, you've created that sense of perceived relationships between the various elements. You've created the stories. So carrying along with that theory, so on these are two images taken moments apart. If you're wanting to tell a story about teamwork, harmony, everyone working together, which one actually feels the strongest image? The one on the left, you've got all the elements, they're facing the same direction, they're close together, they're grouped. There's a lot of similarity in terms of the posture of the horses, the way they're standing, everything feels close together. The one on the right, however, the horse at the back is looking away. Suddenly you've looking at proximity, similarity and everything. The principles do overlap. Suddenly you've got a feeling of two separate groupings. You've got the horse at the back and the driver, and the horse at the front. It doesn't feel like a whole team. It doesn't, if you wanted to do teamwork, that wouldn't be the image. Now they're holding a red rosette up, which probably means they actually won the class. So teamwork, they probably were quite good at that. And it just shows a fraction in time will, and a moment taken out of context, can tell a totally different story from the one that you necessarily want to tell, or possibly that you don't want to tell. So it's really important looking at how and so having the Gestalt principles in mind, and how the images and how the various elements in the frame actually work together to tell the story you want to tell. And I always say this is a little bit of a gratuitous photo. I love how absolutely wet they are. One, I was equally wet. Two, I was actually in the thunderstorms on Sunday taking photographs. So it's possibly a little bit close to the bone at the moment. I do recommend, if you go out in summer and you're photographing in the wet, wear shorts. Skin dries an awful lot more quickly than trousers. Everyone was laughing at me in shorts until I was the one who was actually dry in a relatively short period of time. But here, once again, if you just look at the groupings, your brain mentally thinks that's two separate groupings. You've got the guy, the horse and the lady, you associate as one team. They feel very separate from the guy and the hat. It could all come from the stable yards. They could be brothers. The woman could actually be associated with the actual guy on the right and has just stepped over to help. We don't know the reality, but the story you tell is, by the actual groupings of the elements, you've created that separation and distance between them. And I think this is a really good example in terms of looking at how you put it into practice as well. So you've got this lady with her blue inflatable. I'm slightly obsessed with people in inflatables on the beach. And you've got the two kids. When you look at this, you think of family. You think there's a connection. You automatically think and associate her with the mother of those two children. Why do you do this? Because they're close together within the frame, and also based on how you interpret and experience the world and your own knowledge and experience of the world. It seems a logical thing for her to be. The reality is she could have absolutely nothing to do with those kids. She could have just been standing there with her blue dolphin, waiting for somebody. Those kids just happen to be playing nearby, and the brain automatically looks at them because they're close together. They've associated it as a family unit. If, however, the image was a lot wider, the children were at the far side of the image, a long way away from the mother, possibly there's other bits in between, you wouldn't associate it with a family unit. You wouldn't think they're connected. Even if they were her children, if they were a lot further on the other side of the frame, there'll be a lot more distance between the two elements, and the family connection would have been lost because of that actual distance. You don't have the proximity. You're not viewing it as a grouping. You've been viewing it as two separate groupings. And this is sort of more proper image of mine, an image of mine. and this comes into the storytelling part of me. And it's taken in London, once again, pre-lockdown. Due to the closeness of the elements within the frame, there's a feeling of connection, or more importantly, there's a feeling of isolation through closeness between the two characters, because your eye will take in both characters, the lady walking through the frame and the gentleman. Using his eyes, his gaze appears to be in the direction of her. His head is looking there. There's an implied line of sight. And it's very much about London, how busy it is, how crowded it is, yet everyone is in their own little island, isolated. And then we have the Gestalt principle of continuation. And this is when the mind assumes that lines extend beyond the edges of a frame. So if you look at this image, the road stops about 3/4 of the way up it. Mentally, do you think the road stops there, or do you fill in the gaps? Do you expect that road to continue? It's out of sight, but you expect it to go a lot further into the hills beyond. And this is what the law of continuation is about. It helps create a sense of depth that adds to the narratives. Even when you can no longer see something, the mind believes that it continues beyond the point you can see. And it can be really useful to create perception of size and scale. So, for example, if you photographed a few trees, a small grouping of trees, and you had the trees from edge to edge of your image, so there's no space either side, it just continues from one edge of the image to the other, the brain will automatically assume that these trees will continue going in that pattern beyond what you can see. You can create that feeling of a big forest and a big wood by just a few trees. If you crop the trees off the top, also your brain fills in that gap. You don't think just because the trees are cropped off halfway up that those trees actually stop. Your brain creates that feeling of height. You imagines what the top of the trees will be. Conversely, if you take a photograph of a wood and actually leave space either side in the frame, you can make that wood actually feel a lot smaller than it does, because you can see either end of the wood within the image, and it doesn't, you know, the wood stops. The brain doesn't expect it to keep continuing going beyond the edges. So this is how it works in practice. An image of mine in Stratford Station, East London, rush hour again. And looking at that, what do you think the tube carriage is like? What do you think the conditions are like? Do you think that tube carriage is rammed full? Looking at the platform, do you think the black platform is really crowded? There's people as far as you can see, desperately trying to get onto the next train. Certainly, because I've cropped off the edge of the people. There's people to the very edge of the frame. All the information we've got is it's full of people. We assume those crowds are going to go beyond the edge of the frame and fill the platform. The reality could be actually that beyond these people, there's no one behind them. We don't know. We're not given that information. But the mind, using the theory of continuation, creates that feeling, and what we know of rush hour creates that feeling of a really busy, crowded, packed platform. Also, the train, we can't see inside it. We can just see part of somebody going into the train and people all crowded around the entrance of the actual door. By the huge crowds, what we perceive as the huge crowds on the platform, and also the fact that we can't see inside the actual train, we assume that train is absolutely rammed full, both the law of continuation and also based on our own, how we experience these situations. Anyone who's ever been on trains in rush hour would expect that to be rammed. So we put our own, how we interpret the world onto it as well. But as far as we know, actually that train could have been straight from depot. It's absolutely empty. I've just caught the moment where the actual doors have opened and that people are just starting to go on, but actually there's lots of room. I mean, I think about the story is actually, I think it probably was rush hour, but by how the moment it's Photography, you take a moment out of context, you take a moment out of time. By what you include and don't include in the frame, you control what the viewer thinks about that image. You control how the viewer experiences that image. You control that story. So by the crop I've got, I've actually created that feeling of an absolutely rammed, busy platform and rush hour with people trying to squeeze onto the platform itself. And I should probably never follow my photos with Cartier-Bresson. And this is Cartier-Bresson's iconic image, a man leaping over a pool of water. And I think one of the things which makes the image memorable is the fact the man is suspended in the middle of the air. His heel is just outstretched, captured at the moment just before it touches its reflection in the water. And here you could say the decisive moments become the decisive distance. And you've got the Gestalt principles of continuation, proximity, and closure here. You know how he's going to move to continue the leap. His heel is close to his reflection, so you have both proximity and closure at operation as well. Your brain closes the gap. The distance between the heel and the reflection of the heel on the water invites the viewer to participate in the photograph by completing the leap. If he'd been suspended much more, if he'd been suspended a lot higher in the air, it's caught at a different moment, the narrative and how you imagine the imminent splash wouldn't be as strong. And I think this is a really important principle. This is what they call figure to ground. And why it's important is that it's this which actually makes your subject stand out. It enables you to be, by using this principle, it enables you to be clear what your subject is. I mean, sometimes the viewer's eye can't see the subject clearly because it's merged with its background or other elements in the photo. Photography is 2D. So whilst in the real world we see separation and space, it doesn't actually exist in photography. The figure to ground law helps us to explain which element will be perceived as the figure, the subject, and which will be perceived as the ground, the background. Our mind will tend to perceive the area with the most contrast as the figure and the larger area as the ground. In short, think of light on dark, dark on light. When someone talks about separation in an image, this is normally what they mean. It's making your subject stand out from the background. So this is an image by Fan Ho. He is an iconic Chinese street photographer. Amazing enough, I always find it amazing, he's not hugely well known in the UK. He's much better known over in the States. And his images are largely about light, shape and form. So when you look at this image, where does your eye go? It automatically, one of the things which has a lot of pull in the eye is human form, organic form. It has a lot of visual weight. We'll come on to that a little bit later. But also it stands out so clearly from the background, that form. You could, there's a really, really light background and the dark shape and figure of the man and his boat. He pops out from that photograph. You know what the photographer wants you to look at. This is coming back to Yashiro Ogawa, the Japanese photographer we talked about earlier on. And once again, if you look at this photo, and if the background, of course, going back, is, of course, it's shot during his travels throughout Asia, so the train's very relevant. But if you look at this photo, the lightest area in that photograph is that train. It stands out from the environment. It very clearly is the subject. It's very clear where the photographer wants your eye to go. The train is the subject, and the rest of the actual environment is like a supporting cast, scenery on the stage. It adds to the story, but the subject is the actual train. And this is an image of mine I took in Bradford a few summers ago. And once again, it's very much all about sort of joy, youth, light. It was amazing. People were so incredible. Normally, you can't take photos of children without people getting irate, parents getting irate. They were so incredibly chilled here, which is brilliant, because I think there's so much joy within that scene. But what makes the subject stand out? They're dark against the lighter background. Your eye very clearly goes to them. They're not blended in. they very clearly pop out of the photo. It's not just light and dark you can use to create that separation. You can use colour as well. This is an image by a lady called Tabitha Peach. She's an international award-winning photograph. She now lives in Nuremberg in Germany, but she was born and raised in Romania when it was still a communist country and was isolated from outside influences. When she was growing up, she would dream about what the rest of the world had to offer, and the dream became a reality. And this was the basis for her series, Playing Games. I think she explains it extremely well. The series itself was built upon her endless gratitude towards the freedom she'd been gifted, and as a reminder that locations like the ones displayed in her works, as fantastical as they may seem, do exist and are to be preserved for generations to come. And this is where it comes back to photography as a language. You may or may not like this image, but it's her way of expressing where she's come from and where she is now. And if you come back to the figure to ground separation, the strong colour contrast between the person with a hockey stick in the foreground and the rest of the image makes that very much the subject. That's where your eye goes. It's very clear where the photographer wants you to look first and where they want you to, and what the scenery is around there. As I say, coming back to the analogy from the stage, these stars play, and then you've got the scenery around, which sets the location. And also within wildlife photography, you can use depth. It's very commonly seen. People use depth of field to create that separation from the subject and the background. It's an image by a photographer called Melissa Grew. And I absolutely love that moment. She's caught that owl. And once again, what makes photographs with impact, what makes it interesting is that strong storytelling narrative. Okay, so that is the end of part one. I say I have about a quick 5-10 minute break. How do you fancy?
Yeah, I think that sounds good.
I'll just stop sharing. Gives everyone's brains a chance to recover.
Yeah, there's a lot of information. It's really interesting. I'm really quite enjoying this, to be honest. But yeah, I think a few minutes break will be a good thing. I'm just trying to figure out how. Oh, they will try and take you off the spotlight. Just while we take that little break. Right, guys. If we break for 5 or so minutes, okay. I'll go and top up my water and so on, or Natalie will go and find another bottle. And we'll meet back in 5 minutes.
Yeah, not that bad. From Sussex. Can you send it down here?
I'll leave the meeting running, obviously, so feel free to chat amongst yourselves, guys, okay? And like I say, I will be back in a few minutes anyway, just to keep things going, okay? See you in a few minutes, guys. Caroline, then, before we carry on, is now an okay time just to ask if you have any questions so far? You're on mute.
Yep. Yeah. And I also know it's a lot of information. This is why I say it's very much a starting point. It's raising awareness there's something else out there rather than what's currently talked about. And it's also where the reference are coming in as a starting point.
Yeah, I'm certainly finding it really interesting. You're right, there is a lot of information that's new. It's got my brain a little bit. So I think that's even from Angela. Even looking at some of those images, the one that was just up there with the train in the middle of the shot, I think if I took that, I either would have tried to zoom right in to try and catch the train as close as possible, or if I took it as it was, I think I'd look at it and go, oh, it's rubbish, the train's tiny, you can't even really make it out. But looking at the way it's been done, you're absolutely right, the visual impact of it is really, really good. It absolutely draws your attention straight into it. And it's amazing. And there was a few of them kind of as I went there, I thought, if I took that, I'd probably scrap it.
But it comes back to what are you trying to say with the scene and how are you trying to communicate? How do you experience it? Towards the end, I've got an image of Holcombe Beach, and I think it displays in Norfolk. I'll talk about it. So I'm not going to give too much away here, but it is absolutely 100% my reaction to the actual situation I was in. And actually, one of the things I like doing is randomly going and driving somewhere no idea really, no research of where I'm going, no idea what to expect. And then when you get there, you experience things for the first time. You've no real preconceived notions of what it's going to be like. And therefore your photographs become a reaction to actually how you've experienced it. And I think it's much more impact than if you'd gone and said, looked at what everyone else has done, because they would have been somebody else's photos or derivatives of somebody else's photos, as opposed to, I've arrived here, this is what, and every single day you go, the environment's going to be different, the place is going to be different. I mean, I think that Heraclitus, the philosopher, says, if I got it right, you never cross the same river twice. Every single time you go into a location, it's going to be different.
That's really interesting, because even that kind of goes against your conventional advice of, always prep, always plan, always check everything before you go to a new location, kind of thing.
The one proviso, the one warning I'd give there was, I went to some, is if there may be a possibility that where you're going may involve a boat, possibly check the boat's going, it's in season. You can only freestyle it so far. Yeah, I never got to where I wanted to go that day.
I guess it depends. If you're just sort of loading up your camera and saying, I'm going to go and see what I find, then why do you need to prepare? You're just going to experience what you experience.
And your images then become a function of how you've experienced it.
Exactly.
It's your reaction. And it comes back to the communication. It's your reaction to the situation you've got yourself in. Sounds awful. Probably appropriate with a boat. And also, I think the other bit I love, I have to admit, the other bit I love, is also a side effect of that. And it's your ability to explore the world. If you got into your car on your own and drove somewhere random, got out and walked around, it'll be a bit sad. If you've got a camera, however, you're there with a purpose.
Yeah.
I get into my car and drive to somewhere undisclosed and walk around on my own all the time. It's wonderful. Because it's just about exploring. It's just about, yeah. You've definitely made me think so much, though, Caroline. In what you've been saying.
And I mean, it's very much where this, and it's what I said in the beginning, it's where this talk came about. Because I was listening to people telling me do X, Y, and Z. No one was really able to tell you why, which for me was never good enough. Why would I do this if I don't know what I'm doing? And then how hard it is to actually, and this is why I say it's a lot of information, but it's a starting point. There's something else out there, because it was incredibly hard to actually find that information. And it's a case of like searching. Okay, a keyword. I use that keyword to do more searches based on that keyword. And gradually, as it's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle of lots of very, very similar pieces, and actually slowly connecting them to actually start getting the information. And once I'm still learning, I'm still reading, I'm still developing. But the more you find, the easier it then becomes to find the keywords. It's A, knowing is out there, and B, having sort of some of the bases, just ideas to start with, from, and the sources to go to.
I like how you were talking about the images, like, you're always looking for that focal point and the background point. I found that quite helpful.
So focal point and the background point?
Yeah,
figure to ground.
Where you were talking about the figure in the ground. I found that quite helpful, because then you know exactly what you're trying to focus on during the picture.
It's making sure that say your subject stands out when someone looks at it, they know what your subject is. And I don't cover it here just because, as you can imagine, this is a huge subject. I've done a top line bit, but I always think it's something really useful to think about in terms of where your focal point is in the image. What do you choose to focus on, and why does that matter? the sharpest part of the image is normally where the viewer will perceive the subject to be. If something's not sharp, generally your eye will tend to go to the sharpest part. You're telling the viewer that's not necessarily the subject. Obviously, there are things which are deliberately not sharp to create a certain feel, but in general, 90% of the cases, if something's obviously sharp, obviously is the subject, but is not sharp, you then create this feeling of sort of visual conflict, where your eyes and brain are trying to go, that's definitely the subject, and you're trying to bring it into focus. And I say, not everything in an image needs to be sharp, but actually, how do you control? It's looking about how you control where the viewer looks. And it also then comes into if you're doing a scene of a lake, where do you put the focal point? If you put the focal point at the very base of an image, you're very much telling the viewer, I want you to look towards the base of the image. If you put it further into the lake, you're encouraging the viewer's eye through the image to the sharpest point. So you encourage the journey through. So it's just, yeah, it's
It's fascinating.
Right, guys. Well, we allow Caroline to carry on now. And,
okay. So the world's most nerve-wracking bit, which is always the sharing the screen bit.
bring you back in the spotlight. There we go.
Okay. Portion of the screen. What's going on there? Okay, share.
All yours.
Are you seeing section 3?
We are indeed, yes.
Good God, that went smoothly. Yeah, I actually rehearsed the sharing the screen bit before talks. Okay. So coming on to the next section, and this is looking a little bit more at. So we've talked. I suppose the first half is probably quite philosophical in nature, and there's got the Gestalt, how we view things, to give you an introduction. This goes on to just a few more sort of technical areas and what impact the choices and decisions you make have on the actual image itself and how people experience it. So I mean, a key thing, starting point, what is in the frame, what's out of the frame? If there's one thing that will improve the composition of your photos above anything else, it's simplification. And this is what's in the frame, what is out of it. It makes it very clear what the subject is and what you want the viewer to look at. Eliminate everything that isn't necessary. Everything you put in the image, the viewer will believe is there on purpose. Art is an additive, I can never say this, art is an additive art form. Photography is a subtractive. Art, you put things onto the canvas. Photography, you take things out to actually make it clear what you're trying to say. And I think this is a really useful phrase to remember. The more you have in an image, the more you dilute the impact. And if you look at a lot of photographs of great photographers, they've simplified the frame to the core elements needed to tell the story. A really good exercise is to count the number of elements in the frame of photographers when you visit galleries or look at books, and then extend this to your own work. You'll be amazed, actually, how few elements a lot of these images have. And I think the way to think about it is this. If you have 10 elements in your frame, your attention to varying degrees is going to be split 10 ways. Some of those 10 ways can have more pull in your eye than others, but it'll be still split 10 ways. If your attention is only split 3 ways, then each item in the frame gains increased importance. It stands out more. It's competing with less for your attention, and therefore it makes it easier to tell your story. And I think it's important to remember, by the act of putting certain things in the frame and leaving out certain things. Actually, are you recording?
So trying to find mute. Yes, it is recording.
Cool, perfect. By the act of putting certain things in the frame and leaving out other things, we're saying, look at these things, they're important. The key, as I said, the key thing is the viewer thinks everything in the image is important, and they will look at everything in the image. The more you give them to look at, the less impact there is of each item. And I mean, there's an absolutely great quote from David Duchovny again. I've often heard defensive cries from students when I suggest they've included too much or not enough in their photographs. When I've questioned their framing and asked whether it might be more powerful had different choices been made, I've heard over and over again, but that is how it is. Wrong. The role of the photographer is to make choices. The frame forces us to choose. If you're going to choose, then it's best that you choose while keeping in mind that the reader will make the primary assumption that everything you've included is there on purpose. It means something. And I think it's also useful to take this idea to the concept of, is there actually truth in photography? So you can use your framing to create new realities without ever having to use Photoshop. Framing takes things out of context. It creates relationships which don't exist. You can tell new stories by separating individual elements from their surroundings. It brings to the attention of the viewer that the subject what we want to express an opinion about and show the world. I mean, an example is, I saw this years ago in some program. It was a news image, I think in the Serbian-Bosnian conflict, of a small child lying in the grave. The narrative around it was child traumatized, parents died, lying in the grave. This is how traumatized the child was. However, a photograph is just a moment in time without context. And a photographer can never be entirely neutral because they bring their own interpretation, views, and opinions about events into the image. They want to show something. And in this particular case, the reality was, a second later, the child got up and ran around. It was lying in the grave as part of a game. But by taking the photograph, when the photographer did, capturing the moment they did, not showing any of the surroundings, they took the actual child in the grave, in the hole, out of context and actually made it say something entirely different from what the reality was. So framing can be incredibly, incredibly strong in terms of giving voice to what you actually want to say. And thinking back to the examples we gave for things like continuation, etc., you can see how choices of frame influenced your experience. So this is coming back to my event photography again. And just to recap, when we were talking about something as opposed to of something, I think this is quite a good example to look at. And we'll then talk about the impact of framing on it. So what's this about? So what's this of? This is of a pony with grass in its mouth on a bank and a child holding onto it. What's it about? Naughty pony, pissed off child, really probably had not had a good day. The story is far greater than the actual individual components within the image. But then if you look at the framing, how can we actually bring out the story? In the first image, the bank takes up nearly a third of that image. Therefore, it gets nearly a third of our attention. What does that bank actually add to the story? How important is it? What important information does it contain? Do we need as much of it in the actual image itself? The impact of the pony and the child in the frame and the story is far greater in image 2 than 1 because we've reduced the amount of bank. There's less for us to look at, and therefore the child and the pony are larger within the frame. They take up more of the frame, they take up more of the image. So this story becomes a lot stronger because it's a lot less diluted. So that's the first image. That's the second. That's the first as a second. The story is far stronger because the elements take up more of the frame, as I've said. Coming back to this image, the Don McCullen one, the Battle of the City of Yu, South Vietnam. Once again, very simple framing. It's just got 3 main elements within that image: the soldier, the picture, the window. It's very clear where the photographer wants you to look, what they want you to focus on, what they want you to think about. There's nothing there distracting, there's nothing additional to look at. If he'd included a lot more detail, the individual elements, the impact of them would have been significantly diluted. But here, because he simplified it to the core components, the image itself has a lot more impact. And then this is an image by Martine Frank. Martine Frank, a lot of people are not aware, Martine Frank was actually the partner wife of Honoré Cartier-Bresson. She very much, however, wanted to become a photographer and known in her own right. So she was very conscious of not actually gaining success through her association with him. I think once again here, it's a very surreal image, it's a very quirky image, but once again, it's really conscious framing within that. Every element within that frame adds to that sort of quirky, odd story. So you've got the boy in the hammock in the foreground with his shadow, then you've got the woman with the downward dog, the woman lying down in the strange white balls. She's created that mood and atmosphere by what she's chosen to include and what she's chosen to exclude. And how the elements relate to each other also impacts how the viewer reads the image. It impacts how their eye moves through the image. And we'll talk more about this later on when we look at visual weight and visual hierarchy. So briefly touching on point of view. Now, the next two images I will be showing for the point of view are using a lady called, are produced by a lady called Cindy Sherman. And she creates these cinematographic images using herself as the main subject. So in this first image, it's got a feeling of anxiety, worry, concern, vulnerability. Yes, you've obviously got the expression within her face, on her face. However, a lot of this is also created through shooting down towards her. If you shoot downwards, you create a sense of vulnerability, physical insecurity, figure to ground. Physical insecurity, power balance. It's the person who is, and if you think about what it's like in real life, if you're sitting on a chair and someone's towering above you, looking down at you, it very much feels like they've got the power balance. You feel you're quite likely just to stand up to actually go meet them on their eye level to restore that balance, make it feel more equal. You can create that sense of mood and vulnerability through photographing down at something. The reverse is shooting up at something. The choice of angle of shot will once again influence what you're saying about the subject. When you shoot up at something, you make it feel more powerful, more dominant, more confident. It creates a sense of size and strength. Once again, it's the angle of shot you choose to create that sense of mood and environment and emphasize how you've experienced something. Then we come on to visual weight and visual hierarchy. Visual weight tells you what to look at. Visual hierarchy tells you in which order to look at the elements. The greater the visual weight, the more the eye is drawn to an element in a photograph. The visual weight of the various elements tell the viewer what the subject is and controls the journey of the viewer's eye through the image. It tells the viewer the order in which to look at things. Every element in a frame exerts a certain amount of pull on the viewer's eye, and our eye is drawn to some things over other things. Making a significant element larger, brighter, sharper, and so forth will make it more dominant. And it's an understanding of this and playing with it is key to saying what you want to with an image and directing the way the viewer experiences your image. Visual weight is not just about composition, it's about message. And I mean, there is no definitive list of what gives an object visual weight. It is contextual to a certain degree, but some guidelines are things such as human organic elements before inorganic, sharp over out of focus areas. And whilst it says light tone over dark tone, think to the fan ho example. There it is actually contrast, and contrast almost dominates light over dark to a certain point. Saturation, your eye gets pulled to heavily saturated areas. Warm colours over cool colours, your eye gets pulled to warm colours. So there's a whole list of choices you can make which control what pulls the viewer's eye and what doesn't pull the viewer's eye. And this is an example I've taken from this website, Tuts Plus. In this first image, it's a very peaceful, minimalist image. Your eye is all sort of fairly blue tone, the lightest area over the mountain in the distance, sort of strong contrast. Your eye will tend to travel up through the photograph towards the mountain. However, they did a really interesting experiment with gel lighting. So if you think about that image, and then here, they've used a red gel light to light the foreground. So think about warm colours over cool colours. It's a large area of the frame. It's strong contrast from the rest of the image. Suddenly your eye tends to go much more to the base of the image, the red area. It doesn't so naturally travel through the image towards the mountainside. The actual base becomes more important, more of a focal point than the actual mountain. It becomes more of the subject. And that's how just using the red gel has created that greater visual weight. And then if you compare the two images, you can see just something as simple as the contrast in colour has actually created two totally different feels with the same image. The visual weight of the different elements in the frame has changed entirely just through the actual shining the red gel light onto the foreground. And this is an example of how you can do that in your post-processing. I mean, the amount of comments I've had about how sort of lucky I've been with the lighting, it's like, yeah, I wasn't lucky with the lighting when I started. Through post-processing, I've actually created the light and dark where I want it to be. The image on the left, it was originally taken in colour, but the image on the left is more of a straight conversion from black and white. Nothing really pops out or stands out as the subject. So I very much want to think about, where do I want the viewer to focus? Where do I want them to look? How do I control how they look? So the image on the right is the processed version. I've done quite a bit of work toning there, but the key thing is I've made the gentleman on the table significantly brighter. He pops out more, he stands out more. He's more obviously the subject than on the image on the left. So to compare, that was the before and that was the after. You can see in the after he stands out significantly, and that's just using post-processing to control how the viewer looks at the image. This is an iconic image by Josef Kudelka. What people don't actually normally know about Kudelka is, however, that before the Prague Spring, he was actually a theatre producer who's never taken any photos of news events. This all changed, however, on August 21, when the Warsaw Pact tanks invaded the city of Prague, ending the short-lived political liberalisation in the Czechoslovakia that came to be known as Prague Spring. In the midst of this turmoil, he took a series of photos which were somehow smuggled out of the country. And a year later, after they reached New York, Magnum Photos distributed the images, credited to an unknown Czech photographer to avoid reprisals. And even 16 years later, after it took a long while before he could actually be known as the author. These images won the Robert Capa Award, but it took 16 years before he could actually safely acknowledge authorship without fear of reprisal. And this problem is still happening in terms of press and photo and freedom of journalism everywhere in the world. But I think it's just an interesting background. But coming back to the visual weight element, thinking about organic element, the arm, it's large in the frame, it's very dominant, it's at the bottom of the frame. Your eye will automatically, and I think this is the moment the tanks invaded, your eye will automatically go to the arm, go to the watch, and then take in the surrounding scene. It's very clear where the photographer wants you, the viewer, to focus. This is an image by René Barré, and it shows that actually contrast top trumps here, the lightest area. Where does your eye go first? You've got the organic elements, the strong contrast with the background, figure to ground, what we're talking about. It's those people on the right of the image. That's where the subject is. That's where your eye goes first. And then it goes down to the road and explores the rest of the image. But it's very clear what has the greatest visual weight, what the photographer wants you to look at first. And then this is from Martin Parr and his Last Resort series taken in New Brighton. As an image, really interesting bit of social documentary, but looking at it in terms of the visual weight, she's very clearly the subject. She very clearly stands out. Why is that? There's quite a lot in this image, but she's very clearly pops out. Everything else is the scenery in the background. Well, obviously, she's the only one who's actually directly looking at the photographer. She's got that strong eye gaze and contact. Everyone else is either looking at her or looking down. But also, because you can see 3/4 of her body, she's relatively larger in the frame compared to the other elements. And if you look at her clothes, compare those to the tone of everything else in the image, the black or very dark jumper and trousers, that makes the stand out and contrast from the surrounding area as well. So all these factors came to make it very clear that she's the subject, she's the star, she's what the photographer has the greatest visual weight, what the photographer wants you to look at first. Everything else then is the supporting cast, creates a scenery and stage around the images taken. And this image is winner of World Press Photo by, I always feel really bad because I can't actually pronounce him, his surname's Chiba. Shot in the Sudanese capital on 19th of June 2019. His image depicts a passionate poetry reading during a sit-in as part of protests calling for an end to the 30-year rule of the dictator Omar al-Bashir. And once again, when you look at this image, your eye goes immediately to that person in the centre. He's large in the frame compared to the other elements. His clothes are lighter. There's a passion and emotion in the face. That's where the light goes. He's very central in the frame. Typically, things which are central in the frame, you associate as being the subject. Your eye automatically tends to go to the centre of a frame. So all of this makes him really very clearly stand out. He has the greatest visual weight. He's a subject. It's very clear that the photographer wants you to look at him first and then take in surrounding areas. So using an awareness of and using visual weight and hierarchy will give us greater control over how our final image will be experienced by the viewer. If we're making a photograph about something, not of something, it will help us significantly achieving our goals. If the area with the greatest visual weight is not the subject of your image, then you're not going to communicate as clearly. The viewer's eye will be pulled to the wrong things, the things you don't want it to be pulled to. You are not going to be communicating as effectively as you can through your image. And then the next thing I'm looking at is visual intensity. And this was that book I showed at the start, I think Guide to Visual Intensity it's called. It's a really interesting concept in terms of how you start understanding how the viewer is influenced by the different elements within the frame, how they feel in response to the image you've shown them. So fundamentally, this is what visual intensity is about. It's about the amount of energy in an image. Too much or too little energy can make an image unappealing. If a person plays a single note over and over again, it will be boring. If they asked you to listen to 5 songs at once with the volume turned up as high as it could go, it'll be overwhelming. It'll just be noise. And somewhere there's a happy medium where the music is not monotone and it isn't just noise. Photography operates in a very similar fashion. There's a happy medium of visual intensity needed to create an appealing image. However, as a photographer, you should choose the level of visual intensity in your image so that the image reflects the mood you want to create. So a busy city will have more visual intensity than a minimalist Zen landscape. It's an intentional decision. It comes back to tools, not rules, consequences, choices. However, even Zen landscapes will need to have enough visual intensity to remain engaging for the viewer and not boring. It's about balance. So how to create visual intensity? You think about breaking an image down to its components and thinking about how dynamic or not they are. If you know what sort of thing makes an image visually intense, you can then make conscious decisions. Is the image overwhelming? Is your Zen-like image calm, or is it too busy, or is it too boring? And these decisions happen both in the taking stage, the image selection stage, and the post-processing stage. And as with everything, of course, personal taste does come into it. It is subjective. So, I mean, for this first image, it's by someone called Trey Ratcliffe. For me, the visual intensity is too high. It's an image which makes me want to step back and go, whoa, or too much in the face. It's high contrast, high saturation, bright sort of reds and greens, lots and lots of lines of the trees, lots of bright spots. For me, it's just not that comfortable to look at. It's just too much. And this is the way personal taste comes into it. This, however, is an image by the same person. Still a very busy image. There's a lot going on. It's of a city scene. The busyness of it really helps convey that mood and environment of a sort of hectic, busy, bustling city. However, there's quite a strong blue, coolish blue tone throughout it, and this has a calming effect. It takes out some of the visual intensity to make it more pleasing to the eye and not necessarily so overwhelming. You've got a sense of the city, you've got a sense of an environment, but it doesn't necessarily make you want to step back and go, whoa, too much. But sometimes you can actually choose to do that. It can make a conscious choice. What are you trying to say about the subject matter? So this is an image of mine. It is deliberately has a high level of visual intensity. It's deliberately edgy. It's deliberately that little bit uncomfortable. The guy in the foreground, you say the sharpest part of the image is where your eye goes, what says the subject is. You'd generally expect him to be the sharpest point because it's the person. By the fact it's not, it's created that visual tension. It's made it feel that bit uncomfortable. It's not what you'd expect. And it fits with the overall feel I wanted of the image. You've also got the strong contrast of the black and white, the very busy background. It's very much an image about an urban, edgy scene, an urban, edgy part of London. And for me, it kind of conveys the feel of that area. In absolute contrast, however, we have Michael Kenner, who is one of my favourite photographers. He is known for his very minimalistic, very Zen-like images. And here, this is an image over in Hokkaido in Japan. Very, very simple image, just the snow and the fence. But you've got the repeating patterns of the line of the fence posts, and you've got the diagonal of the fence posts going through the image at the top, and you've got the contrast. All of that makes a very minimalistic image, but it's still engaging. It creates a sense of peace. It's something you could actually look at and relax. It's much more meditative than some of the earlier images. So some things which influence visual intensity. The first thing I'm going to look at is placement of elements. And I think one of the things I've heard talk about, and I think it's such an important thing, is the concept of sketch images. Most of us are now digital. Photography is free in terms of actually the number of images you take. The only cost is your time when you get them home and you've got 9 zillion on your camera. So go out, and an artist would have a sketchbook. They'd draft things, they'd play with things, they'd sketch things. Do the same thing with your camera. Explore, experiment, play. So this was taken in Canary Wharf in London on a foggy day. And it's obviously absolutely the same scene. I was down there and I was playing and experimenting. And it's 2 different versions of the actual same shot. In the first version, the lampposts are a lot closer together than the second version. The visual intensity in the first version is much higher because when things are closer together, your eye goes back and forth between them. You create much more visual intensity, create much more tension. Your eye takes in both elements. By separating the elements, as I've done more in the right area, it gives each element a little bit more room to breathe. It's reduced the level of tension within the image. For me personally, I find the image on the right much more comfortable than the image on the left to view. But it's what you want to do and what you want to create and how you want to say what you want to say for your images. there's an awareness of when you keep put elements together like this, really close together, you do increase the visual intensity within the image. So that's the first one. That's the second. Just the placement of them in relation to each other has changed. Very, very simple, but very, very different feel with the two images. I've done the same thing with this guy. It's just playing with the camera again. The image on the left was the original, and then I played very badly with content-aware move tool for the purpose of this talk. It kind of amused me to do it. I had a bit of fun moving him to the right. But once again, I think it illustrates the point very well in terms of how close elements are to each other within the frame impacts the level of tension and visual intensity within the image. So the image on the left, with the two elements close together, your eye goes back and forth between them. They're grouped together much more. The image on the right is a lot easier, a lot less tension to view because there's more distance between them. So you've got him there, and he jumps there. He's there, then he jumps there. So it's just by how close elements are to each other in the frame, you can very much control how an image, it's something very, very simple, but it can control how an image feels. And then the next thing looking at is orientation of the frame and what you're trying to say with an image. What do you want, how it impacts how the photograph looks or feels. So how do you read an image? Should it be read, how do you want the viewer to read the image? Should it be read vertically or horizontally? Tall frames emphasize and even exaggerate the height of the subject. They create upward movement. A portrait format can be used to emphasize the layers in a photograph. It also encourages the viewer to read the image vertically. On the other hand, wide frames generate lateral movement and a sense of panoramic vista. They emphasize the width of something. They encourage you to read the story horizontally. But having the wrong framing can also impact how strong the story is in terms of what you include in the image. A horizontal framing of what should be a vertical story is likely to mean that we've included far more in the frame than we need to, which means the viewer has to sift through far more to get to the story. And as we said, the more you have in an image, the more you dilute its impact. So when you frame a photograph in a landscape or portrait format, you're providing clues to how you want the photographer to read the image. You're not just saying, look here, but you're also saying, look in this direction. But it also impacts on the visual intensity as well. And I saw a diagram yonks ago, and I've never been able to actually find the actual original. So this is my very bad reproduction of it. I do apologise. It's amazingly hard to draw on a screen. But typically in the Western culture, you tend to view left to right. And when you view an image in a portrait crop, your gaze tends to bounce back and forth much more as you view up the frame than if you actually have it in a landscape crop. The travel of the eye on the landscape format is much more leisurely than in a portrait crop. The landscape format is a lot lower energy than a portrait format. And you can then use this knowledge to actually look at how you read the image, how it impacts what it emphasizes, and also how it impacts the energy of an image to actually make an image, once again, feel like you want it to. So this was, once again, some more sketch images I did over in Armenia. This was down a canyon with some really interesting volcanic basalt. The same scene, one portrait, one landscape. The landscape crop is a lot less dynamic. You've got a lot more of every single item in the image. I always describe it like as someone writing an email covering 2 pages of A4 when they could have put it into 5 bullet points. You lose the viewer's attention by having too much in it. The one on the right, so the one on the left, you can see its portrait crop is more dynamic. It emphasizes the layers, but it's much more, as I said, much more dynamic feel to it. It has more energy. And it'd be the world's most exciting photograph. But for me personally, once again, it comes to personal choice, but for me personally, I think the portrait crop works much more effectively than the landscape. It also encourages you to read up through the layers. So you start at the gravel at the bottom, then you go to the basalt tubes, and you go to the bit at the top, as opposed to just reading lengthwise. So it's that versus that. Same subject, totally different crop, totally different feel. And I did the same thing with this little rock, little stream going through the water. Different crop, same subject. The one on the left emphasizes the stream much more. It feels a lot more dynamic than the one on the right. So you have that compared to that. And this one is specific, especially because the stream flows down through the image. It emphasizes that element of it. So obviously, portrait crops encourage you to read vertically up through an image, top to bottom to top. Then this is an image by Martine Frank. Once again, it encourages you to read the image vertically, which really emphasizes the story. She's excluded any extraneous parts. I think this in itself is a really fascinating image, the detail she's included. But we come down to how much you got in an image. There's three main areas to this image. You've got the children, you've got the slide, you've got the building. And because of that, there's nothing else to focus your attention. So the story of the children playing within the environment is much stronger than if you'd included a lot more detail in it. And then this is an image of mine within of a memorial in Armenia. And once again, the portrait crop, it emphasizes the height of the actual monument. It emphasizes the height of the walls around the lady, but also it means that I've taken out a lot of the extraneous detail either side. You've got a sense of the wall and the environment where I'm shooting it from, but I've cropped out a lot of the extra detail. So you've just got just enough for the storytelling aspect and the placement of the image within the context, but not too much. And then we get to placement of subject. And I think this is a key thing, and this is where it really all started off. Do you place your subject in the center, on the third, close to the edge, or cut off by the frame? And as I said, it's where I started my journey. And with judges telling you to put things on thirds, and me going, well, what impact does it have? Do I even want to put it there? Why not in the middle or closer to the edge? How does it impact the viewer? What impact does it have? And what I'll start off with saying, there's absolutely nothing wrong with placing your subject in the centre, despite what quite often you're told. People instinctively spend a lot of time looking at the centre of objects. And I think one theory says our brain assumes the object in the centre of an image will be the most important. We look instinctively there. However, what to be aware of, the centre of the frame is a very visually balanced position. There's little visual tension there. It's a low energy position. It doesn't have much visual intensity. And therefore, if you place a subject in the centre of an image, it needs to get its visual intensity from elsewhere to make the image engaging, either by other objects within the frame or just by the story and narrative itself. It's about creating that balance of energy. So also to think about is the closer to the edge of the frame the subject is, the more visual attention I have. So this contrast to the lowest energy is within the centre, the closer something to the frame is, the more attention it'll have, the more visual intensity it has. And then once again, this is where it comes to making conscious choices. It's also remember in the Western world, we read an image left to right. When the subject is placed on the left third of an image facing right, they'll move along an implied line with a moderate amount of energy. They'll have a lot of room to move into. The image will be about what is going to happen next in the motion. The more to the left a person is, the more visual intensity there'll be, because more speed can accumulate over the frame. Comes back to Gestalt again, and actually how there's a lot more going on in the background than we know in our mind, and how we look at things then would immediately be obvious. If, however, you put the subject at the right edge of the frame, then there's a lot of energy there, visual intensity, because the subject is about to leave the frame very quickly. Soon he won't be part of the image. You can use this to put tension into the image. And this is a brief diagram I put in just in terms of the science aspect of it, by Herbener, Turbergen and Whitlow, probably not pronounced anywhere like that. They found, and this is where it's reproduced, they found that positions in the frame also have inherent semantic meaning. If the subject is higher up in the frame, the image is more active and more potent. When the subject moves away from the centre, there's more emotional tension in the image. And here they've used the stars just to illustrate how the tension changes dependent on where the subject is, the central being the least tension, and it increases as you reach the edge of the image. And this is a little sort of image. These are, well, how would I describe it? This is an image of mine. The one on the right is my final image, but I thought for the purpose of this talk, I'd play a little bit with the crops to look at different impacts. So the one on the left is obviously she's the more traditional position. She's skating into the frame. There's a moderate amount of visual intensity as she's on more towards the third. Then in the middle is the lowest energy position. She's still got energy. She's still got visual intensity, because obviously her position, the motion, the actual colour of her clothes, the contrast in the image itself is really sort of strong reds and blues, which creates some visual intensity within it, the contrast. But the image on the right is my final one, where she's skating out of the frame. I like that, and it comes about, once again, conscious choices, not necessarily what you're told is right, not necessarily what you're told the rules is. It's knowing what your choices are, what the consequences are, and then going with what feels right with you. And here, I liked the slightly more edgy feel of her skating out of the image to the right, and the visual intensity it added to the image. So that's central, the most neutral, slightly more energy. And then that's the final one, my choice. And as we mentioned, this is an image I took out of a top floor of a bus in Bradford. You just had to. I'm sure I'm probably slandering this poor man all over England. It's probably entirely coincidental that he's running down the street with a TV under his arm. Nothing going on, nothing to see here. But I made a very conscious choice of placing him in the centre. Why? Well, for me, yes, you've got a man running down the road with a TV under his arm, but it's also the environmental context of the suburban high street, which I really liked. It's placing that environment around him. And in terms of visual intensity, yes, he is in a low energy position, but he's got motion and action. You've got strong saturation of the building. You've got the story as well, adding to it. And once again, it was a conscious choice. I could have placed him, when I looked at my images, I'm on a bus, I need to grab him quickly. I have a number of images of him, but this was actually the one I chose out of the images I've got, because I wanted him between the actual driveway gates. I wanted that suburban context. I wanted that environment. And this is an image by Vivian Mayer. Once again, central placement. Does it work? Absolutely. Is it a strong image? Does it have impact? Totally. Whilst the central positioning is a low energy position within the frame, the story is so strong. And actually, it wouldn't have worked as well if this had been placed more towards a third, because, as I mentioned beforehand, typically you expect the story, the main subject, to be in the middle. And it's such a strong subject, and it really deserves to dominate the frame. It's where the interest is. And then this is an image by Christopher Thomas. I came across him in Hamilton's Gallery, which is a small selling gallery in London. I absolutely love his work. Luckily, from my pocket, he doesn't seem to have published a book, which is probably quite good. I could save up for it, so I imagine it'll be expensive. But this is from his series Bittersweet. And he describes the photographs as oscillating between sadness, joy, regret, nostalgia, youth, experience, evoking a loss of innocence as a childhood left behind. And I think this is a really interesting image. Once again, the main subject is placed very centrally within the actual frame. Does it work? Absolutely. It asks so many questions of the viewer. This roundabout in the middle of nowhere, no sort of sign of human habitation around. And once again, it comes down to Gestalt, theory of continuation. There may have been a house just to the right. You can't see it, so you assume that this actually grassland will go on for a long distance either side. And then it's like, well, why is the lights on? Where are the children? What's happened? So, I mean, and also the thing to remember is when you place something in the actual center of an image, it acts to a certain point to block the viewer's eye from going on beyond, because it actually, you go there, you stop. It's saying, this is where I want you to focus. This is where I want your gaze to stop. So you're conscious of the mountain behind, but actually the thing which dominates entirely is the roundabout. I say, such an interesting image. I absolutely love that one. And this is another one of his. And here he's now placed on the third. It's still a really interesting image. It still asks a lot of questions. It's still very simple. But by his choice of placing it on the third, it now encourages the viewer to take in the tricycle and then look beyond to actually the mountains and the surrounding environment behind. So by moving it to the side, he's influenced the way the viewer looks at the image and influenced the way the viewer then experiences the image. So it's there, the first image was very much roundabout dominant. Here it's about the tricycle, but a lot of it's about the tricycle and environment and the emptiness of the environment. And there's a strong fit, once again, a strong feeling of loss, which comes through, also helped by the slightly desaturated colours. And I think it's something to remember in terms of when you create your image, your eye will tend to go and follow the course of least resistance. So if you leave a passageway like that for your eye to travel through, it will easily go through. If you block that and put lots of obstacles in the way, your eye will tend to stick with the obstacles. And this is another image of mine. It comes back from that beach promenade series about the weirdness of the coast. This is brilliant. This blessed woman, she was walking into the frame. She saw me, I'm sitting on the ground taking photographs. She saw me taking photographs. She's like, oh, sorry, stopped, hesitated, and got out of my way. Little did she realise that A, I was taking photos of her, and B, I absolutely love the fact how she's half in, half out of the frame, looking at me. Once again, it's something slightly odd feel about it. Also emphasised by the strong contrast, the red and the sky. And I really like the dynamic about this. If she'd been nicely walking through the frame, from left to right, facing the direction she was going, etc., 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 in a much more conventional fashion, for me, it wouldn't have been half as interesting a photo. I probably would have just discarded it. But here it's because she is cut off, because she has caught the attention. It's that slightly odd pose, which for me makes it a really interesting image, and it works with what I'm doing with the series. And then we come on to the final bit, you'll be pleased to know, lines. Every line has a different impact on how the viewer experiences the image and what it says. So horizontal lines, and this, once again, bear in mind, when we do this, it comes back to Gestalt. It's not necessarily what something seems like on the surface. It's a whole load of brain processes, thought processes, which go on behind in the background, which we may not be necessarily aware of, but influences how we see and interpret things. So horizontal lines are associated with stability, rest, solid ground. They anchor the frame, they create a sense of width. And it's when we talk about associations, what do we associate with things which are horizontal? Horizons, falling trees, sleeping people. And how stable is we talk about visual tension, how stable is a horizontal line? Can a horizontal line fall over? No. Sort of very stable. And you can use horizontal lines to create a calming effect. You can use them to emphasize width in a landscape. Vertical lines, however, they've got more energy than a horizontal line, not as much as a diagonal line. So talk about visual intensity, the least visual intense ones are horizontal, the most visual intense are diagonal. So vertical lines emphasize power, strength, growth, dignity, height. You can use these, once again, in your image to convey that feeling you want. Diagonal lines are the most dynamic form of line. They have the highest, well, horizontal lines, so vertical lines can fall over. Diagonal lines are the least stable. They're the most likely to fall over. They have, they draw the viewer's eye through an image, they give it more space, depth, and movement. They create a sense of action. They make an image more dynamic, they lend energy to it. And as I said, they've got the greatest level of visual intensity. So looking at this in practice, so I talked earlier on about Holcombe Beach and my reaction to it. So to put a little bit more context about this, I am not really knowing what Holcombe was like. I kind of knew the household cavalry exercised their horses there, hence I'd heard of it. And I was vaguely thought it could be quite nice to have some horses on a beach. They weren't going to be there. But that is about basically my sum total knowledge of Holcombe when I turned up. Also, usage of knowing where toilets would have been better, but that's another matter. So I arrived in Holcombe Beach, and you arrive in this car park, and it's full of incredibly loud, screechy people. Even the men are screeching at each other at an incredibly high-pitched level. And it's all really noisy and hectic. And it's like, oh God, this is not so nice. And then you go with the screechy people along a walkway through, I think it was a forest, trees or something, and across some dunes. And suddenly you come out onto this mass expanse of beach. Now, I come from the south of England. Our beaches aren't that big. So it had an extra impact on me because it's not what I'm used to. And it was just this really hectic, busy environment suddenly became this huge, massive space where all these people just disappeared into tiny dots on the horizon. It was an amazing sense of peace and quiet and relaxation. And here, looking at sort of talking about how you can create that feel, the more letterbox, horizontal lines create and emphasize the feeling of width. Letterbox crops such as this, especially quite extreme letterbox crops, add to that perception. And then by the size of the elements within the frame, obviously, it adds that sense of space as well. But it's very conscious choicing and framing to create that sense of peace, tranquility, space, which I sort of experienced stepping out onto the beach away from the really, really screechy people. This is an image by Paul Hart from his series Truncated. And once again, you've got a real sense of sort of trees. Portrait crop emphasizes the height of the trees, helped by the fact he's cropped the top off, so the theory of continuation. You feel quite small in the frame because the way angle he's shot, he's shooting up at them. It makes you feel quite small in the frame compared to them, like you're walking through this massive tall forest. So he's used sort of the angle of shot, the framing, the crop, all to emphasize this feeling. This is an image I took in London. Once again, the portrait crop emphasizes the height of the walls. And for me, it's very much about this small private moment in the big city. By emphasizing the height of the walls, the aim was to build on the sense of sort of intimacy with the two people and make it feel like a very sort of private moment, interrupted and caught. This is an image by James Nachtwey. He's a Magnum photographer, and his work is amazing, but also his philosophy. There's a quote, I'll talk about the image in a second, but I think there's a quote I like to share from him. And I think for me, it's really hard hitting. I have been a witness, and these pictures are my testimony. The events I've recorded should not be forgotten and must not be repeated. And I think that's so important. I mean, I actually bought one of Don McCullum's books. Obviously, I like his work, but why did I actually also buy his book, one of the war ones? Because photography is such an important medium to communicate what's happening and what's happened. People can change the narrative, they can reinvent history, but images actually tell the truth. Images remind us what has happened in the past. Here, this is an image of a prisoner on a chain gang in Alabama. And everything about this image is designed to create that tension, edgy feel. So you've got him at the bottom right of the image, cropped off, adds dynamic tension. He's very small against this tall fence. Then you've got the strong diagonals of that fence. The diagonals left to right and right to left are overlapping, which adds to, which creates a pattern, adds to visual intensity. It's all designed to create a mood, create an environment, to say something about the subject he's photographing, put his voice across. And then we have, in absolute contrast, we have an image by Alex Soth, also from Sleeping by the Mississippi. And this, I think, is a really interesting image to demonstrate the impact of diagonals in an image. Very simple image, very minimalistic, nothing going on whatsoever. However, he's added visual tension by the inclusion of a number of strong diagonals. You've got the diagonals of the left, bottom right, top left diagonal of the reeds against the water. And then you've got the strong diagonal of the mattress crossing that diagonal. It's all taken a very, very simple image, and through the inclusion of diagonals has added visual intensity to make it engaging to a viewer. And this is how sort of knowledge of these things can actually help you take a subject matter and make it feel like you want it to feel. And then, of course, we've got this image by Fan Ho, sort of fairly iconic image of his, the approaching shadow. Once again, the inclusion of that strong diagonal adds an element of dynamic tension to the image, makes it more engaging than if it hadn't been there. It's also used a lot in sports photography. So these are two images by Darren Heath. One, he's used the strong diagonal to create this feeling of movement, tension, dynamism, everything you'd associate with motor racing. You compare that to the mood of the image on the left, which feels a lot less dynamic, because obviously he's also used things like panning, but the feel of the two images is entirely different. And you'll often see people in sports photography, especially things like motor racing, using diagonals to help create that dynamic feel. And this is an image of I did myself over Westfield again. Back to my love of people walking accidentally into the frame. Got strong diagonals, adding some dynamic tension to the image. They also here form a leading line, taking the eye from the guy in the bottom left up to the girl on the, so bottom right to the girl on the left. And I think this is also an interesting image in terms of context and viewer interpretation. That when people look at this image, there's so many different things they take away from it, depending on their view of the world, their experience. For me, when I took it, I just thought it looked like they'd had a row, and I quite liked it. They'd had a row, he's pissed off, she's gone off in a huff. But obviously, when other people look at it, they look at the fact she's white, he's black, and there's a whole additional narrative going on, which I hadn't necessarily seen within the image itself. So this is why there's actually several people in an image. It's not just you, the photographer, but it's also the viewer, and then the context as well. And this especially, I think, was taken around the Black Lives Matter period as well, which added to the whole narrative surrounding it for a lot of people. I'm much simpler, I just went ahead around. Implied lines. So this comes back to Gestalt again. The brain resolves incomplete lines based on experience. We know what will happen when an object falls or is thrown or pushed. We can predict how it will move. So if you see an image of a football and someone kicking a football, the football's going through the air, you know the trajectory of that football, what will happen. So this is why often people will say, leave space for an object to move into. It then allows the brain to fill in that trajectory of where the actual object will move to. Implied lines can be used when there's not an actual line. They can influence how the viewer how we want the viewer to understand the image. As with that previous image, they can create connections between objects. And also, I'd say, remember, not everything is noticeable at the taking stage. the image selection stage is absolutely critical, because this is often, especially as I said, fast moving, like something like street photography, you notice things when you get things home which you may not have noticed. You may have responded to in the street, but you wouldn't have necessarily consciously noticed. So this is just a quick image just showing sort of implied lines. You can see the different directions which can be perceived as an implied line of travel. So the horses are moving around, their gaze is looking towards him. You create that sense, once again, to create that story, you create that sense of connection with him. He's looking to them, he's creating that sense of connection, he's moving to them. So it's all the implied lines within an image can help add to the story you're trying to create. And this is an image of mine. It was done actually in Photo London. It's not set up. He was walking past with a child. And once again, it's when you get an image home, you actually sometimes see what you've got. I wasn't actually necessarily waiting there even for a photo. I was just wandering around taking photos of things which caught my eye. And I think probably what caught my eye was that child. She was miserable, she was unhappy. She was on her father's shoulder, not thrilled with the world, probably overtired. But then when you get the image home and look, what I really liked was the guy, transvestite or drag queen, in makeup in the poster in the background, and the gaze, and there's a real look of concern in the face, and the gaze is in the direction of the child. There's an implied line of sight towards the child. And once again, it comes back to only child overactive imagination. But for me, it very much, also thinking in stories, for me, it's like the poster's almost come alive and it's expressed concern about the child being unhappy. But yeah, sometimes you live in your own world. So I think we discussed this a little bit earlier on. How do you put it into practice? So research the subject more. I've given you some brief topics, so books which will help. It's looking at keywords and then just building on that search. And the more you look, the more you find. It's getting started on the journey, I think, which is the challenging bit. Mindfully look at a lot of images we're talking about. Think about the compositional elements of the subject. What works for you? What doesn't work for you? What do you like? What don't you like? How does it impact you? How does it affect you? Be conscious of how your eye travels through an image, also how you respond to them. As I said, practice Martin Parr. As I said, you take a lot of shit images, sketch images, and osmosis. The more you look at, the more you take in, the more you mindfully think about things, the more it subtly seeps into your consciousness unawares. You're not copying, you're not trying to do what someone else has done, but it just seeps into who you are. And as I said, as I mentioned, to quote what we said earlier on, Martin Parr, take a lot of shit, be kind to yourself. The top photographers only take 5 to 10 good images a year, maximum. They're lucky, they're pleased if they've got that. We need to be realistic. It's going out there and just practicing. But I think the thing is also, the more you practice, you make your own luck. I mean, a friend of mine always used to say, oh, it's just a lucky shot. However, the more you practice, the more you take photos, the luckier you get. You create your own luck. Oh, as I said, Martin Parr said, take a lot of shit. And I say that's the reference material, but I send it through in an email so that it can be distributed out to people who are interested. And that's it. So it's quite long. I keep trying to cut it down and I keep failing.
We have gone a bit over, so thank you all very much for hanging on in there. And I can't talk now either. I'm just going to start off by saying thank you, Caroline. That was absolutely mind-boggling in a very good way. It's definitely making me think about even my own images, how I frame them up and how I might look to try and change how I'm taking them, or particularly be more conscious of what I'm going to try and frame up. I'm sure I'll still take, like, say, a lot of shit photos and a lot of what I currently take, but I will go out with that specific intent in mind. And it's probably something I'm actually going to open up to everyone on the call and everyone who's watching the catch up and so on, is to try your best to think about everything that we've covered off in this talk here tonight, and over the next couple of weeks or so, try and go out and see what even elements, even parts of it. Don't try and do it all at once. Even if you can go out and put a couple of these into play in your shots and just do that little bit of practice and see if your thinking is different, if your shots are coming out different, if you think you're getting more visual impact with having that consciously in your mind. Okay, Lisa, I know we've run over a little bit, but do we have any questions? I see a few people have come off of mute, so I'm going to take that as a yes. I've got a few in my head, but I don't want to hog the light here. So who wants to jump in?
Very quick question. What is a sketch image?
You're going out and playing, basically.
Okay.
You know, it's literally as it says on the tin. Because you know how an artist will have a sketch pad and draw?
Yes.
It's kind of a similar thing with a camera. You just go out and sort of like, try this, try that, try the other. Does this work? Doesn't that work? I think you hear a lot of people commenting negatively about chimping. I think sometimes this is where some of the elitism comes into it. Because actually, because actually, what you want to do when you're trying to improve is actually saying, take something, did that work, didn't that work, how can I do it differently?
Mm-hmm.
So it's literally just going out and playing. So we're not film anymore, digital's cheap.
Yeah.
Experiment.
If you're not familiar with the term chimping, it's literally taking a photo and looking at it straight on the back of the camera and thinking if it's good or not.
Yeah, with regard to photo sketching, because I tend to do a lot of it, your mobile phone is invaluable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really is. And if you're really interested in looking at things like that, I would recommend to you Eileen Rafferty for a start. She's absolutely brilliant.
Okay.
Series, absolutely stunningly brilliant. And have a look at the work of the writings of Grant Scott, New Ways of Seeing. He covers photo sketching, and he also runs a website, the United Nations of Photography, which is excellent. I recommend that to you as well. And again, thank you, Caroline, for such a really, really brilliant, interesting evening.
Yeah, it's been really good.
Yeah, and I'd say hopefully, I mean, as I said, there's a lot of stuff out there, but I think for me, hopefully as well, what it does is when you're fighting against the tide and you're hearing a lot of people from camera clubs, etc., it's giving you that empowerment and freedom. And just knowing there's different things out there.
Yeah, any other questions?
I need to digest first.
That's absolutely understandable.
So it does tend to blow people's brains, and let's say it's not something you're going to remember everything of. But I view this as there's something else out there which people don't talk about. There's a different way. This is the start of the journey. It's a long process, but there is a journey there.
I'm going to ask just a couple. I'm going to try and keep them quick. Just when you mentioned that, Sarah, though, for the guys in the clubhouse, when we do our little social catch up in a couple of weeks, we'll swing back to this and see kind of how, once we've had a bit of time to digest, as you say, we'll have a little chat over that and see how it's impacted us and kind of any other things that we might be thinking about on the back of it. And we'll see if there's any extra watching we want to be doing or sharing.
I'm happy to answer any questions which come to you at a later point. So just reach out to me. I'm happy to answer anything.
Much appreciated. Thank you. Yeah, a couple of quick questions then for me. So a lot of those images were black and white. So on a very top level, do you think or find that black and white is more visually impactful?
It depends on the subject matter. Some subject matter lends itself to black and white. Some subject matter lends it to colour. Black and white does emphasize emotion, but all my work on the actual beach and coastline is colour because it's about that surrealness. It's about the gaudiness. So it's just choosing what's your subject matter. How does it feel to you? What do you want to say about it?
Cool. That makes sense. Thank you. I'm just trying to keep my brain functioning at this point.
Sorry.
No, that's absolutely fine.
He says I'll successfully cut it down and make it shorter.
Another one is, obviously, you've said it a few times that you like when people walk into your shot, and you've demonstrated that in some of the images, which I really, really like. In terms of the aperture, because nobody is, although some of them are obviously not sharp, nobody's like completely blurred out. You're obviously not shooting at like 1.4 or anything like that, where there's no depth apart from the exact point of focus. So do you tend to shoot a fairly narrow aperture? That, or is that just coincidence based on the light and the settings that you've used at the time?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends various lights and situation. It depends what I'm doing. For a lot of my more beach shots, I tend to just stick it at f11, because it's like literally what I literally do is I sit there by the path on the floor and just grab people as they come through. And once again, it comes down to experimentation. So typically, what I would normally do for bases doing street work would be a shutter speed of 250. But then you sit yourself down on the beach and you have bicycles, you have scooters, you have all sorts of stuff turning up. So actually, I've kind of learned from this. Some of the stuff I wanted is actually, and I say it's sharp is always appropriately sharp for the subject matter. I felt the level of sharpness wasn't suitable for the subject matter. Therefore, I need to, next time I go back, I go and play and experiment. It's sketching with everything, play, experiment, learn, see what works, see what doesn't work. And also see what you enjoy and like.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. And one last one for me. On the image that you showed was the carousel in the middle of the nowhere, essentially the open plains. There was a lot of empty space around it. And as if we compare that to, for example, the one that you use of the Naughty Pony shot, where you've cropped off a fair bit of the bank. And again, this will come down to the individual circumstance and so on, but where do we sort of draw the line as to what do we think is too much empty space? So there's a lot of the foreground, which you could say adds to the sense of emptiness, but there's a lot of the sky as well.
And once again, it depends on the subject matter. With the pony, the bank really had no importance other than to give it to something to stand on. Now looking at the carousel, it's very much about that roundabout in the middle of nowhere. It's about the space. It's about the incongruity of the roundabout being amongst. So actually a key part, one of the things I say is what you include in, how does it add to the story? That roundabout wouldn't have been so interesting if it wasn't a roundabout in the middle of this large empty field. And in terms of the sky, when you include a lot of sky in an image, you create that sense of space, you create that sense of airiness, you emphasize the space in the image itself. So it's very much, what are you trying to say with the image? And what do the bits you include add to the image? And if they don't add to anything to the image, then you consider, well, do I actually really need them there?
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Right, last chance then for anybody else who wants to jump in with any questions. Nope. Okay, I'll just mention a couple of quick comments. We've got from Nathan, Angela, and Jenna all saying thank you in the chat. I don't know if you've seen the chat. Saying thank you, so informative. Thank you very much. Can't wait to practice. Thank you. Alan's dropped in the book that you mentioned. Yep, absolutely. I will have a look at that. Thank you. So again, just for guys in the clubhouse, we'll catch up on this in a couple of weeks. If you're not in the clubhouse, absolutely have a look. You are more than welcome to join us on that catch up as well. And Caroline, just once again, thank you very, very much for your time. I know I booked you short notice, so that's appreciated too. But no, that was very informative. And like Sarah says, I think we all need a little bit of time to go and digest and play about and practice a little bit.
Practice a lot.
Practice a lot.
As I say,
so good.
the more you take, the luckier you get. But just to build on to also what some mentioned about Alan mentioned about mobile phones, never underestimate a mobile phone. The most important camera is the one with you. There's an amazing magazine called Frames Magazine, and they do a digital companion. I had an image of mine used in a digital companion. It was done with an absolutely ancient, knackered Samsung S6, which is probably about 6 years out of date by that point. So never underestimate the importance of that. Really, you don't need a good camera.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And yeah, I don't really know what else to say now. Just to
So,
Good night.
yeah, thank you for inviting me. As I said, happy to answer any questions anything comes up to you afterwards.
Yeah, will do. I think we've had a very good kick-off session for our first hosted talk. So thank you for starting us off.
I have a suggestion for round 2.
Oh, okay.
Is that we all go and practice and then pick an image and bring it back and invite Caroline back to discuss it.
More than happy to.
That would be really nice, because then we've had time to sort of like work with it, and we'll find a lot more questions coming out.
No problem. I'll speak to you separately about that one, Caroline. Okay, guys, right, I will end things there, okay? Thank you again very, very much for you guys who have turned up live, and even if you're watching the replay, thank you all very much. And again, Caroline, one last time, thank you very much for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.
Cheers, thanks all.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.